So today we are talking about peak height velocity. So what is peak height velocity?
When we talk about peak height velocity in our context, we're talking about as kids are going through development, the rate at which they're growing. So other than when they're babies, where they grow really quickly, during our teenage years, we see what we call peak height velocity, where guys and girls go through this rapid growth period. Now, that's not to say they don't go through multiple, but what we talk about with peak height velocity is it's the period where that is happening at its quickest.
And so why is it important to consider, peak height velocity when programming for youth athletes?
It's important to consider the peak height velocity because, so for me, I've always had it in the back of my mind, but we're putting it more and more front and center because what we see is this massive variation in kids at this age. So we're talking from 10 through to 18, but it's complicated by this massive variation in how each individual develops, not just from a height, but then weight, muscle mass, or the things we talk about like power, speed off the back of that, even their maturity, their ability to think their way through things, handle pressure, confidence, all these things have big implications to their just biological maturation, which kids don't have a lot of control over. This is a genetic link. So the more we consider it, the more we can then put them in appropriate, groups or training programs that match where they're at. So one, to get the most out of that block, that window they're in terms of their training, but also two, avoiding the risk. So I'm sure we'll discuss some of those different programs and age brackets, but I think it's from a performance standpoint, how we maximize things, but also how do we manage risk in these kids when they're going through such rapid changes and there's a lot going on in their lives.
So you touched on it there, but what do we sort of focus on pre, during and post peak height velocity and why?
So what we've been looking at more and more with our testing is how do we categorize athletes based on peak height velocity, and where we're sort of falling is for each individual categorizing them as 1 year pre-peak height velocity. So then they go through from that 1 year to 1 year post. So that means they're in that peak height velocity window. So we can say pre-peak height velocity is 1 year before or earlier, and post-peak height velocity is that 1 year past it or later. So that might be 2, 3, 4 years past it. Early on, so in those pre-peak height velocities, what we're working on a lot here is, so typically we see a fairly low growth rate, but our nervous system is really plastic, meaning we can get a lot of, performance gains from nervous system type training. So things like our coordination, ingraining really good movement patterns, and that sort of links into our speed work is a lot more applicable here. We've got to be really careful because they're pre-peak height velocity, so we're talking about immature bodies. So we don't want too much load and too much volume on these kids, which is a common mistake. Under 10s, under 12s, we see in sport training, lots of volume, lots of running, these sort of things. And it's why we see a lot of common term growth-related injuries and pains and concerns, but a lot of it is just overload in immature bodies. There's a high variability, so we've got to just be mindful of how we adapt and progress and regress in that window, because if you look up a range of year 5 and 6 primary school kids, you're going to see this huge difference in sizes and shapes and abilities. And just mindful as well, reinforcing that the physical side will catch up. They are pre sort of that development phase, that it's just patience at this age. And sometimes the kids and parents are in a rush, and it's just that it just can't be because they're just physically not ready yet. So then when we get from that sort of year into their peak height velocity, then sort of a year past, this is our peak growth period. So we're seeing that typically what happens is bones grow actually pretty quick through their growth plates. Muscles and tendons are struggling to adapt. So kids generally get pretty tight. They can get a lot of soreness either in the joints or in the muscles. As a result, we often see a bit of the nervous system struggling to catch up. So we see a coordination drop off. So adolescent awkwardness, or baby giraffes. Sometimes we see that, particularly if they've gone through a pretty decent growth spurt, with off the back of that, we see an increased injury risk, especially at things like growth plates. So we see a lot of the Osgood Slatters, the Severs, that sort of stuff really sort of become more prominent at this point. And we start to see, because of things like the hormonal shifts and stuff going on internally, that strength, energy levels, all these things start to change. So sometimes a bit of a drop off, and then we start to see at the other side of that peak height velocity, those sort of things start to increase. So then post peak height velocity, sort of looking at these as now more young adults. I guess they're closer to an adult sort of body and mentality because their growth rate starts to really stabilise. There's now an increased capacity for our strength and power development. Coordination starts to return or improve. So obviously we make sure that we've restored that and really try and enhance that. Training becomes a bit more predictable, a bit more robust in terms of, we know more likely if we do this, we get this outcome. And then confidence and those physical traits really start to build off the back of it.
So around the time of peak growth, it's a bit more of a sensitive period with a higher risk of overuse injuries, sort of particularly in joints and the growth plates like you mentioned. Why is this sort of the case?
With the rate of change, so body, that adolescent awkwardness we mentioned around, so a lack of coordination. So as a result, we lose a lot of our movement skills. So something as simple as landing from a jump or a deceleration where we might have been technically pretty sound, whether we had the strength or not, we could control it a lot better. Now we don't, or a lot less so. So therefore, they put themselves in more vulnerable positions more often. This age too, you've got kids that are early mature, so they might already be in that post-peak height velocity phase. So they're strong, they're powerful, they're bigger. You've got a kid that's a bit more of a late developer, only coming into that window now, and they're going head-to-head with some of these kids. So then things like contact-related injuries, so tackles, knocks, that sort of stuff skyrocket. So we see emergency rooms on a Saturday night, lots of broken arms, these sort of things off the back of collarbones, off the back of impact-related injuries. With our peak height velocity, often in around that same time, we get a weight gain. So now there's more force. So just because you're bigger, there's more weight. So if you don't have the skills to handle that, so like proper landing mechanics or the proper deceleration mechanics, at the same speed, there's more force. So now you've got a lot more stress. And then as you repeat that, then things can start to break down. And that's fairly common.
So what are some of the case studies that you've seen over your time and even recently in the gym?
There's one recent example that's a really good one because non-identical twins. So what we see, so obviously being twins, same birth date, when we look at where they're at, to look at the boys, the brothers, they look very different. And then when we actually look at their peak height velocity, that sort of maturation level, we've got brothers, genetics very similar, same birth date, actually 6 months apart by biological age. So one's 3 months pre the middle of that peak height velocity and one's 3 months post. Right now, does that change a lot of what we're doing in terms of just like a general training philosophy? Probably not, because they're so close to their peak height velocity. But because in 3 months, 6 months times, it will, because one's out the other side of that window while one's still sort of in the window and just moving past it. So basically what it means from my point of view is we're looking at very much right now good mobility, good control, introducing some of the fundamentals, making sure that coordination element is restored or maintained during that peak height velocity. But for the early maturing brother, then he can start to look at that strength power development potentially a little bit earlier than his brother, even though, as I said, twins, same birthday. Had other kids where sometimes they both come in like 13-year-olds, some are almost already past that window and some are a year prior to it. So I guess the point is we get such a big variation. What we know is birth date isn't a great indicator. What we also know is like the time of year. So often we talk about January versus December born. If they're matched for their maturation age, if that's identical, then yes, the January kid is 11 months ahead of the December born kid. But what can happen is the December born child can be 2 years ahead biologically, and the January born child could be 2 years behind. So they're actually so it'd work out to be 3 years apart. So the December born child actually be 3 years ahead. So we've got to be careful around just looking at birth dates and actual chronological age, because we know maturation doesn't link to that. This is a separate entity linked back to genetics, and we've got to make sure that we're factoring this into where we assign those kids in terms of programs and training groups and that sort of stuff.
What are some of the risks associated with getting the programming wrong in either pre, during or post?
Probably the big risk is injury, drop out because it's either too hard or too easy for them, doesn't sort of match where they're at right now. Within that, there's obviously still technical ability. So if you're waiting till you're post peak height velocity, more physical mature to work on your strength and power, well, you still might be starting at fairly basic levels because you might not have the technique to add load, but mainly, injury, burnout, dropout for those reasons. Then the other thing would probably just be lack of results. If they're not doing the right sort of training, are they just sort of wasting their time, just doing general things, and then potentially leaving themselves short further down the road? So the classic would be, if you're 13 to 16 years old, my recommendation, you shouldn't be doing unsupervised gym. I just do not believe at all that that's the case, because if you're in and around that peak height velocity window, like I said, we've got to make sure technique has to be supervised, has to be coached, because you got to make sure you're doing it properly, or you potentially just reinforce the issues that are happening during that window. So they're getting tighter, they're getting more uncoordinated, they're just working on the things that they're good at and not on their deficiencies. And we see it all the time. By the time they're 17, 18, it just hits them like a freight train, because now there's all these big gaps that they just haven't addressed. And for some kids, it's too late. In terms of elite level sport, if that's the dream, then it just gets too hard. There's just too much to make up. We'd need 5 years to fix it, and we'd have 5 months. So if we haven't laid those foundations, then it just gets really tough for them later on.
So when it comes to sort of our program, how would you program for someone who's in, during and post?
In terms of our, key training outcomes for each phase. So pre, for us, it's very much movement competency, fundamental motor skills. So our key gym movements, and then linking in sprinting, jumping, throwing, sort of rotation, coordination, balance, rhythm, basic sort of body weight strength or some light resistance type work, just for that control motor skill component. Making sure mobile joint control's there, because if they're tight before peak height velocity, they're probably only going to get worse when they go through that growth spurt. And just fun, exploration, things like really quality over intensity focus. So a lot of them start out new to training, really awkward, can't get arms and legs to sync in the right way. So the more we can enhance those really basic skills, the better off they're going to be as they go through their rapid growth phase and post what we can do with our training. During the peak growth phase, as I sort of touched on, it's the really, again, movement quality. So really trying to maintain that, because their bodies are changing so much. Again, prioritizing the jumping, the running, the landing mechanics, the things that are probably most risky for them, and the things that they're probably seeing the most change with or most deterioration with. So that awkwardness probably affects those things the most. Basic strength through really good range. So really focus on technique. We know strength is still protective, so we don't want to avoid it, but we've just got to be careful with how we load it and what movements we're doing, how we adjust that depending on the level. Lots of mobility, lots of things like isometric holds, because we can get them in position, we can teach skills, we can get specific with our strength work. It's really safe. Like I said, lots of landing mechanics, all that sort of stuff. We've just got to be really careful with loads and symptoms and that sort of stuff in that group. And then post, we're more structured strength and power development in the year after that peak height velocity. We can focus a bit more on load, intensity, and a bit more of the individual needs, more advanced sprint, jump work, change of direction mechanics, and we can start to look at those things under a bit of fatigue. So this is sort of the first time I've mentioned fatigue. So this is where volume starts to build. We've just got to be obviously really careful pre that, because there's enough going on. We don't need to just smash them with volume. We're looking at that resilience off the back of that, so building a bit of that repeatability, and then really into that long-term athletic profiling. So what's sort of the end goal? Really starting to get, like I said, a bit more specific with the individual around what their needs are and how we can set them up for long-term success.